Howdy, folks. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a brand new Dungeons and Dragons video. Going to be taking some time here today to discuss medieval guilds, and that's because a while ago I did a video discussing medieval factions or creating factions for your Dungeons and Dragons campaign was actually the exact title of the video. And I had hinted in the video that I was going to take time to discuss guilds in deeper depth because I felt they actually deserve a kind of their own video, if you will. And as you can see here, here's actually a couple examples of some actual medieval guilds with the device or logo, if you would, that they would actually hang outside their business to essentially suggest what type of guild they are a member of and what kind of business they are running. But really quickly, before I get into the video itself, I want to take time and ask you, the viewer, for support. Like, comment, subscribe, share the videos. It helps boost me up in the YouTube algorithm, helps me get more viewers, gets this content out there, and maybe hopefully teach people some things that they can use in Dungeons and Dragons. With that being said, I also do have a Patreon page. That's a great way to provide additional support for my YouTube channel. There is a link down below in the video description to my Patreon. So go check that out, folks. And with all that being said, I also do take, from time to time, post some upcoming videos and some content that I'm working on to kind of give people a peering into what is going to be coming to my YouTube channel. Now, with all that being said, let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's video, and that is essentially real medieval guilds. And I think really the best place to start with medieval guilds is looking at the history of medieval guilds. Now, this is going to cover your merchant guilds, your crafting guilds, not so much your thieves guild or your mages guild. Although, who knows, there might be some little snippets here that you could even use for those guilds. But with that being said, the guilds served a very specific purpose. And essentially, when it comes down to it, guilds were the unions of their time. They would arise around the 12th century AD, and essentially they had a pretty good control of things, of how business was conducted, rules, membership requirements, educational requirements, etc. So medieval guilds actually had a lot of important sway, if you will, during 12th century medieval Europe, and guilds would pretty much run until about the 16th century. Now, with that being said, there was, in general terms, two different types of guilds. The first one I want to discuss here really quickly is the Merchants Guild, and essentially these are just merchants, traders, salesmen. They would also deal with imports and exports, things of that nature. So they would make sure guilds or product would get from point A to point B. They dealt with all that kinds of stuff, which was actually really important for their time. And then, of course, the other side of the coin, you would have the craftsmen's guilds. These would be your carpenters, your sewers, your shoemakers, your hat makers, your blacksmiths, masons, etc. They would all fill in as a craftsman's guild. Now, however, with that being said, even though in general terms there was two different types of guilds, there was also some outliers. The Fisherman's Guild was actually its own guild. They dealt with everything themselves. They dealt with catching the fish. They dealt with preparing the fish. They dealt with the quality standards and practices. They dealt with the sales of fish, things of that nature. That was their primary role. And essentially, the Merchants Guild didn't really have a role or a finger, if you will, inside the Merchants Guild itself. Now, with that being said, guilds were city-based. If you were part of the Craftsman's Guild in, say, London, you wouldn't be part of the Craftsman's Guild in Yorkshire. So kind of think of guilds as separate individual chapters based on city to city. And with that being said, guilds would also have their own guild halls. This is where they would conduct business, keep records, and deal with various general practices and businesses related to the guilds itself. Now, with that being said, guilds did have political power, and they had a lot of political sway, especially if they could get the ear of the king, if you will. They also had a lot of religious interest as well. Understand that this is kind of a time frame where the church is rising and gaining more and more power and more sway politically, not just within the church itself. Now, I want to kind of get into what the guild's roles are or the benefits, if you will. One of those would be advertising. Guilds would had different methods of advertising different businesses that was linked to the various guilds. One of those would be a sign like this, hanging outside the business, marking that the business owner was a guild master, which was actually really important because there was a lot of standards and practices and quality control things that was related to being a essentially a business owner or a master of your trade. They would also take in, because of their political influences, they might be able to open doors for guild members that may not necessarily be open otherwise. Now, one thing I've pointed out a few times too was quality control. Quality control was actually very important within guilds, and actually creating product of poor quality was actually a good way to get yourself kicked out of a guild. So actually quality control was very important, and that was actually the guild made the standards of what the quality control of the products were. They also came up with the rules of how business would be conducted, and they also had education standards when it comes to businesses, which I'll get into a little bit more in depth here in a little bit. Now, one big issue I see here with guilds, outside of their religious interests and essentially their political interest, is that essentially guilds held monopolies over businesses in general. And essentially that's because they decided who could be members of the guilds, what was the standards and practices, who was a master, because the thing to understand is only masters could actually be business owners. And generally speaking, if you were an outsider of the guild would actually go through great lengths to essentially smear you, make sure that essentially you couldn't have a business, things of that nature. Now, let's get into the education standards, if you will. And that's because there's three different titles of guild membership I want to cover here. And the first one is apprentice. Now, apprentice would actually start their way down the path of becoming a master, usually in their mid-teens. And essentially, it was a standard that they would be an apprentice for 6 to 7 years. These were people that essentially they were trainees. They were taught the basics of how to do the crafting, but they were mostly there to handle things that essentially the master or the journeyman just didn't want to deal with, such as cleaning things up, maybe preparing certain materials, whatever. So that's generally what the master was, or an apprentice is. Now, apprentices were not paid. I want to throw that out there right now. However, with that being said, apprentices were provided for by their masters, usually when it comes to food, room, and board. So they were at least provided for. Now, the next title is a journeyman. Now, a journeyman is essentially a person who's actually been in the craft for several years, gone through being an apprentice, and they're basically at the point now where the master can actually trust them in what they are crafting. Now, with that being said, they are still watched over by the master to make sure that they're keeping up to quality standards and using proper business practices. But with that, and then the next thing to cover too is with the journeyman, is the journeyman was no longer provided for like the apprentice was. However, with that being said, the journeyman was paid. So that's the major difference right there. And from my understanding, looking at the documentation, is that an overwhelming majority of guild membership was actually journeymen. Now, with that being said too, and I forgot to point this out, is that an apprentice cannot actually be a member of the guild. They're kind of a probationary member, if you will, where a journeyman actually is a member of the guild. Now, the next one too is the master. Now, essentially, the masters are people that have actually proven themselves. They created a quote unquote masterpiece, which really is not the kind of masterpiece you're thinking of. Most people, they think about like the Mona Lisa as a masterpiece. For guild membership, a masterpiece is just a piece of whatever that proves that they have a very good knack of what their trade is. So if it's a blacksmith, they might have to create a suit of armor or maybe a sword or something along those lines. Basically, something that would take a majority of their skills and that they could use to prove their skills. Masters are obviously guild members, as much as journeymen were. With that being said, they held a little bit more respect and kind of a higher title, if you will, within a guild, a little bit more sway on things. And masters could be business owners. They could have, well, essentially, masters were business owners. They could open their own businesses where journeymen could not. Essentially, journeymen worked for masters, while masters, well, they pretty much worked for the guild. Or, well, I guess technically themselves, but yeah, whatever, for the guild. Now, there is a series of rules and bylaws that guild members have to follow. These are the business practices I keep alluding to, such as a good example is maybe such and such guild. We'll say the Hatters Guild. You can't work past sundown because you got to be able to see what you're doing to essentially create a quality product. Which that was actually a common rule within guilds, is like maybe not necessarily being able to work in certain types of weather, maybe not necessarily being able to work after sundown, maybe make so many products per day or per month, maybe you had to make a certain amount of sales, things of that nature. There might have been dress code related things involved. Guild dues was a definite big one. Guild members had to pay guild dues to be members of the guilds. And with all that being said, the guild rules, the guild rules and bylaws was something that you strictly had to follow. And if you didn't follow those rules, there was consequences. Maybe a first time offense, you would actually have to pay a small fine. With a larger offense, you might have to pay a bigger fine, or a second time offense, you might have to pay a bigger fine. And you might have to surrender any product that you made that day or something along those lines. Now, with that being said, a third time offense, you are usually excommunicated from the guild, and basically at that point, you might as well just pack up your doors and move somewhere else, because you're at that point, once you're excommunicated from the guild or blackballed from the guild, if you will, it was very hard to get back into the guild. And with that being said, you're an outsider of the guild. And like I said earlier, when I was going over like how guilds held a monopoly, well, that's kind of what would happen to you, because now you're an outsider of the guild. They would kind of make sure that you're basically quickly run out of business, and because nobody wants to do business with you anymore because you're no longer part of the guild. So there was good sides and bad sides to guilds. And like I said, in general terms, they were the unions of the time. So that's just something you got to think about when you're putting your guilds together. But anyway, folks, I think I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. I think that pretty well covered medieval guilds for you. But if you got any questions, feel free to ask down below. I will try to answer them the best I can. Anyway, folks, thanks again for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.